Welcome to Season 4 of the California Frontier Podcast. I'm your host, Damian Bassich, and I'm excited to bring you a new season of stories, of interviews, all about and from the history of this fascinating place, which is California. So stay tuned for the first episode of this new season. The Abbey of New Clairvaux is a Roman Catholic monastery in Vina, California, located at the north end of the Great Central Valley. The monks who live there dedicate themselves to a strict regime of manual labor, prayer, and welcoming of visitors and pilgrims that has its origin over 1,500 years ago, when St. Benedict of Nursia wrote down a rule for monks in Western Europe to live by. So a few months ago, I had a chance to visit New Clairvaux for the first time. I got to meet some of the monks and learn about its history. There I found out about a series of people and events in which medieval European monasticism intersected with U.S. westward expansion, the California wine industry, and titanic figures such as William Randolph Hearst and Leland, Stanford. Father Paul Mark Schwan is the abbot or leader of the Monastery of New Clairvaux. I asked him to walk us through the fascinating story of the monastery, its origins, and its place in the history of California.
I'm a native of North Dakota, and I was in seminary there, studying for the diocesan priesthood when I came across a book by Thomas Merton, a celebrated American monk of the Trappist Cistercian order in Kentucky. And you might say I was smitten. I fell in love at that moment. And so kind of a long story short, after I did finish my college degree at the seminary, and I spent 2 years living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, working for a city newspaper there. And I was in discernment, and with this monastery, with several other monasteries of our order. Our order itself goes back as a reform of the Benedictine tradition in the year 1098 in a place very close to Dijon, France. It's still there today, called Citeaux, or Cistercium in Latin. At any rate, it was a reform of the Benedictines, and we eventually got to be labeled Trappist because of another reform hundreds of years later at a monastery of the same order of the Cistercians in a place called La Trappe in northern France, in Normandy. And then those Cistercian monks that followed that reform, and this is, well, in one sense, it goes back about 400 years ago. In another sense, the nickname Trappist began to be used about 200 years ago for that group that continued to follow these reformed principles from La Trappe. But at any rate, I did my discernment, and I came here in 1980. I entered the monastery. And so I've been here ever since, held a lot of different positions, responsibilities in the monastery. And 16 years ago, I was elected the leader, or we call the abbot. Kind of a pastor is probably the best term in church vocabulary. And in the civil world, I would be called the CEO or the president of the corporation. So, but just a nutshell of who we are. We are monks. Monks in the Christian world have been around for some 1,700 years. Again, as a way of radically living the gospel. Going out to wilderness areas or desert areas where few people lived, to enter into a communion with God without as many distractions, as it were, that would have been, had, I guess, the monks had stayed in regular society, etc. So it's always had a radical element. It's in that sense of following the gospel in a particular form, leaving a lot of things behind: careers, family, all those things that other people are not necessarily called to leave behind, like yourself. You're a university professor, and that's what you're supposed to be doing. So, but monks, again, throughout the Middle Ages, and its monks were both in the Christian East and the Christian West. So it's a kind of a universal vocation and call. But in the West, it came to be associated with the rule of Saint Benedict. And this is a rule for monks that was written in the, I suppose, really the very early 6th century, but based on older monastic tradition. And about the year 800, under an emperor called the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, he decided that all monks were going to follow the rule of Saint Benedict. And, so ever since that time, the Benedictine life, as it were, has been very, very crucial in European civilization and education, but just in development of the whole Christian West. And that's what we are part of, even though we are a reform with a different name, as it were, but we are Benedictines. But in the Benedictine tradition, when a monastery reaches a certain number of monks, they discern if they should make a new foundation, send monks out to a new place, and begin a new church, as it were, a monastic church. And so it was in 1955 that this abbey in Gethsemane, or Gethsemane Abbey in Trappist, Kentucky, about an hour south of Louisville, they had so many vocations that they sent out 26, actually I think it was 28 monks to found this monastery here in Vina, California.
Sorry.
Yes.
So Vina, well, first of all, 28 monks. How many monks were at the Abbey of Gethsemane at the time?
Yes.
You said they had so many.
Right. Well, there were, close to 300 monks.
Wow.
Probably some 270, 280 monks. Yeah, it was probably a little bit too big. I should say this same monastery of Gethsemane had founded 4 other monasteries prior to us in the 11 years from 1944 to 1951. And then we were founded in 1955. So it was a time of great growth for that particular house. It's still there. It was founded in 1848 from France, so yeah, go ahead.
So Vina is, can you tell us a little bit about where it is? Maybe a lot of people don't know where Vina is.
Probably most people have never heard of Vina. Vina is located about 20 minutes north of the city of Chico. So that makes us about 2 hours north of the state capital of Sacramento. And we sit right very close to the river, so we're right kind of in the heart of the Sacramento Valley. And 3 hours north of us is the Oregon border. So that's where Vina is.
And why was that place chosen?
Well, we were able to find some very good farmland, which today we realize is probably some of the best in the world that we sit on. There was an active ranch farming operation of orchards, dairy cows that was already in place. A lot of buildings were already in existence, some very old buildings, historical buildings. And so the family that owned the property, they had other property as well, further just north of us, but they were willing to sell this working ranch and farm to the monks of Gethsemane. And it suited our needs and our particular approach to living monastic life, with a strong emphasis on manual labor and self-support, and which usually means, or did mean, agricultural and animal husbandry kinds of industries. So
I know that this that your location has a big connection to California history, and could you talk to us about who the previous owners were and a little bit about the background of that property?
Yes. Of course, going way, way back, thousands of years, the Native Americans, and there were several tribes that, kind of claimed this as part of their territory, and some of them was the Nome Laki, and they're still in the area, the Yanayahi, which unfortunately, that tribe was totally decimated. And it's one of its last members, or its last member, was a man named Ishi. And he's somewhat celebrated as the last wild Indian. I forget how the title goes, but so his people would have lived here along Deer Creek, and we find lots of Indian artifacts along the creek, and that indicated villages, and this goes back maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years, But as far as Spanish and European American settlement, a Danish immigrant who was working for John Sutter in what was called New Helvetia, the city of Sacramento today, Peter Lassen was his name. He was working for John Sutter, and he and another significant member of the history of California, John Bidwell, were sent up to chase cattle rustlers, or they had stolen horses, something like that, from Sutter's fort. So at any rate, they came up to this area, fell in love with the area, and immediately on their return, filed for a Mexican land grant from the Mexican government. This is 1843. And both of them received very large tracts of land. I mean, like in the thousands of acres. And so Peter Lassen, his land grant was called the Rancho Bosque, which means the ranch of the trees. Eventually, it got misspelled as Bosquejo, but it's actually that's a misspelling. It's Bosque. So the ranch of the woods, making reference to a lot of the timber, a lot of oak trees, that kind of thing, black oak, growing in the area at the time. Well, I mean, they still grow in the area right now, but not quite like they were back in 1843. So he got this property and had developed a city, Benton City. I believe it was named after either his father-in-law or anyway, Senator Benton of Missouri. And things were going well. And then, of course, December of 1848, I think gold was discovered there on the American River up by Placerville, Grass Valley area. And that kind of was the demise of Peter Lassen's property here, in the sense that he had another partner from San Francisco, another European immigrant from the Rhineland, Henry Gerke. And eventually Henry Gerke came in 1852 to possess the property. And Peter Lassen went up to the mountains near Susanville, and he died, kind of a mysterious death. No one's too sure if he was killed or murdered, but at any rate, the state decided to name a mountain after him, so we have Mount Lassen, or really Lassen Peak, but anyway, most everyone calls it Mount Lassen, which we can see from the property. And then Henry Gerke, well, I should back up here. Peter Lassen had a very successful, well, he planted vines, grapevines. The story is that he got them from the San Gabriel mission, and they were the mission variety, so.
That would make sense.
Yeah. So he planted these vines, but he, of course, basically lost the property to Henry Gerke in 1852. Well, Henry Gerke was a vintner himself from the Rhineland. So he worked on improving the varietals, primarily whites. And so he had a very successful wine business, winning actually international accolades in the 1860s, the 1870s. So, and he's the one who gave the name Vina. Really, it's Spanish, but it should be pronounced Vina, meaning the place of the vineyards. But at any rate, he gave the name to the settlement. I don't think it was really purposely founded as a town. It's just that workers and other people ended up building homes along near the ranch. But at any rate, he had a very successful winery, and generally of white wines. And some of those white varietals actually we grow today here at the monastery in our winery business and vineyard. But at any rate, as you know, Leland, Stanford, one of the big four, and primarily because of their railroad interests and owning the, what at least that initially was called the Central Pacific. They were putting a railroad line up through this area so they could have better access to the gold fields and silver mines of the Redding and west of Redding. And Leland Stanford decided he wanted the property. And so in 1881, he acquires the property from Henry Gerke. And he had a lot of vision. And he was in many ways ahead. Well, he was ahead of his time. He had gone to Europe. He saw Europeans drinking wine, and it seemed like a healthy thing. And he claimed he never saw any any drunks, as it were, on the streets in Europe. But so he thought, maybe we get Americans to drink wine, in a social way and just with meals, and it won't become such a big thing, alcohol and alcohol abuse. So he proceeded to plant out of his eventually some 60,000 or more acres that he owned here. He proceeded to plant like around 3,800 acres in vines.
Now, where did he get those vines?
Yeah, that, well, a lot of them were right from, here in the state of California. A lot of them were the mission varietals. And again, I don't have enough details, but I do know some of the wines that we're growing today were actually were grown here by Leland Stanford. One was Trebbiano, which is a white wine originally from, well, it still is in Italy. It's an Italian wine. And I know there's a red, and I think it might be the Tempranillo, which is a relatively new wine, red wine, again, to the California wine scene, but he had that, and I believe he was growing that here. But the problem with Leland Stanford, when you have 3,800 acres of grapevines, and you have no machinery like they have today for these really big plantings that you see here and there. He never was very successful, not because he didn't have the good grape varietals, and that he didn't have the professional people he did. He brought a lot of French vintners in from France, from Bordeaux, and some of those family members are still in the Chico area, in the local area, of those French vintners. They're descendants, Every once in a while, someone shows up and says, "My great grandfather worked here. He was one of the French vintners," kind of thing. At any rate, it was just so big. Plus, we didn't have refrigeration in the sense that we have today, and tanks where you can keep your wine, your grape juice at a certain temperature and fermenting. We have this huge, nearly 2-acre red brick building that went up in 1885. That was the wine cellar, double walled, a magnificent building.
It's very impressive.
Yes, it is. But again, no matter what he did, it wasn't cool enough with the hot summers we have. Now, I mean, it is cooler in there, but it's nothing like a cave that would have temperature control, as it were, and even humidity control. So unfortunately, he did not succeed in really producing the kinds of table wines that he had wanted. Well, the unfortunate thing is that in his case, the whole California wine industry Vina left a bad name on the California wine industry. And the idea was you cannot grow or produce good wines at Vina.
Oh, wow.
So we kind of had this cloud over us, but now I'm getting a little ahead of myself with our winery operation that we have now, which has proven that all wrong. But meanwhile, so Leland Stanford, he has all kinds of things going on here. He has a world prize Holstein dairy herd. Holsteins were relatively new to the dairy industry in the United States. And he brought Holstein cows from Denmark or northern Germany. He also had a very successful horse breeding, thoroughbred operation here, which he also had in Palo Alto. Okay. And at one point, around 1891, the Tsar of Russia bought 12 of Leland Stanford's thoroughbreds, and 6 of them were from this property. And that's all recorded. You can find that in archives at Stanford University. But you might ask, well, why Stanford University? The idea was their young son, this was Leland and Jane Lathrop, this was going to be young Leland Stanford Jr.'s playground. Unfortunately, he was in Europe at the tender age of 15, and he picks up typhus. And in those days, I mean, it's still a serious illness. But anyway, he died from typhus. And unfortunately, he was an only child, let alone an only son. So the Stanfords were heartbroken, as you can imagine. And, the famous story, Leland turns to Jane after the funeral or during the funeral and says, okay, let's build and found a university and name it after our son, and the children of California will be our children. And, in those early days, believe it or not, there was a free tuition at Stanford.
Those were the days.
Right. But it almost went under, too, financially, and actually what saved the university in many ways was the selling of this property. And the very last parcel, which we sit on, the headquarters property, about 600 acres, a little 596 acres, I think. That was the last property to be sold by the university, because after Leland Stanford died, of course, Jane took over all the enterprises, and then she died in, I think, in 1916. And at any rate, so the university had all this property and just sold all the property, not just this Vina property, but other properties other than the Palo Alto property where the university sits today.
Okay, very interesting.
We kind of kept the university going in its difficult early days, So at any rate, it's sold to the Shattuck family. That's well known if you ever go to Berkeley, to
Shattuck Avenue,
the university there. And their son-in-law, Colonel Robeson, managed the property. And meanwhile, another important figure in California's history, actually a native of California from San Francisco, William Randolph Hearst, is building a newspaper empire in the United States. It's not unlike probably Mark Zuckerberg or today in the media. He knew how to operate in the media. Anyway,
right.
He became very, very wealthy, and he had lots of properties, and he was buying lots of properties from Europe. Not so much properties, but buildings, artifacts, and he bought parts of seven different non-existing monasteries, but their ruins were there. Okay, from Spain, from France primarily, and he brought some of this over to the United States. Well, in 1931, he bought an entire monastery called Ovila, about an hour outside of Madrid, Spain. And Ovila is a monastery of our order, founded in 1175.
Wow.
Yeah. And it existed until 1835, when the Spanish crown closed a lot of religious houses. At that time, church and state were united in Spain. And so this monastery, which had less than 15 monks, was closed by decree of the Queen of Spain. Maria Cristina was her name. And so it passed into private hands, where it was a functioning farm and ranch from the 1830s for about 100 years.
So the entire monastery was now a farm.
Was a farm. And so a lot of the buildings were used for animals, like barns, or storage. And there's parts of a monastery. Okay, so William Randolph Hearst buys the whole monastery with the plan he's going to dismantle every stone of the whole monastery, ship it to California, rebuild the whole thing.
Now, was he going to do that at San Simeon? Because I've visited San Simeon, and it's a huge hodgepodge of all different styles and architectural monuments, etc. Is that where he planned to rebuild the monastery?
No, although it was another one of his projects, and he has a lot of monastic artifacts at San Simeon there.
Right.
Hearst had a big property. Today, at least, it's 10,000 acres. Maybe it was larger 100 some years ago. North of Redding, at Wintun, along the McLeod branch today of Lake Shasta. The family still has that huge compound, and they still use it. The Hearst, the descendants, of Hearst. So this is what that monastery where it was originally designated for. Well, he got, okay, so in a monastery, there's a church, and then there's a chapter house, there's a refectory, and then the dormitories. Those are the 3 or 4 major common spaces, as it were, in a monastery. And the chapter house is related to the church. It's where the monks gather every day. A chapter of the Rule of St. Benedict, which I explained earlier about, is read and commented on. And then all important decisions are made in the chapter house. Any votes that would be taken are taken there, etc. So it's a very important space as far as religious use, of listening, to the Word of God, or listening to the Holy Spirit, as we call it, and discerning a community's needs and future and its path forward. At any rate, Hearst is successful in dismantling the chapter house, first of all, and is successful in getting it on ships and shipping it to over here to the West Coast. It arrived in San Francisco, of course, and so they had all these stones. So they didn't have time to move them further. So they store them in warehouses in San Francisco. Meanwhile, we're in the depths of the Great Depression, and even William Randolph Hearst, who was even then a multimillionaire, which is unfathomable today. I mean, he would be billionaires, multi-billionaire today, with inflation and the price of what the dollar is worth today. But so he got in financial troubles. And the federal government had to step in because he was so significant to the U.S. economy and industry, especially in newspapers, that if he went under, it was just going to be bad news for everyone. So the federal government intervened to help him out, and they appointed, I forget what his official title was, but his name was Joseph P. Kennedy, whose son eventually became president of the United States.
So the Joseph P. Kennedy.
Yeah,
Okay.
And so he had to step in and was given authority and to rectify the financial situation of the Hearst Empire. So it was apparent that this project to move this monastery from Spain went out the window. And then they had all these stones in San Francisco, and they said, you're just going to forget this project. So there was a deal made that Hearst, or the city of San Francisco, who owned the warehouses, would, what's the word I want? Hearst had to pay rent on the warehouses. And anyway, the city canceled the rent, or the debt, in lieu of receiving the stones. So now suddenly the city of San Francisco owns medieval stones from a Cistercian monastery in Spain. And they're hoping that they can rebuild this building in Golden Gate Park.
I hope you enjoyed the first half of my interview with Abbot Paul Mark Schwan of the Abbey of New Clairvaux in Vina, California. I'm sure you'd like to know what became of those stones in Golden Gate Park. And in part 2, we're going to find out where they wound up and how you can visit them today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says, Give a One-Time Donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.